we'll do what we always do, which is start off with some introductions. So as usual, we're here to exchange knowledge on priority tribal adaptation and resilience data needs. We're going to share some tools, and today we're going to share some research practices, ideas. We'll have some time for discussion. We're always exploring opportunities to develop and scale up solutions to help address tribal resilience data needs. So I think the only new person, we usually try to haze the new people a little bit by just asking them to introduce themselves. And so actually there's two new people, but Catherine, we're going to hold you because you're one of our speakers. So I'll introduce you in just a minute. And Brett, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Angie. Hi, everyone. My name is Brett Folger. I am here to sit in and learn from everyone and see if there's any way I can support the group in my role. So I, about a month ago, started working for NOAA for the Office of Coastal Management, and my role for them is as the Regional Geospatial Coordinator for the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California. And before I get too far, I just want to let you know that I am still learning my role, so I will communicate it best as I can to you all, but it's still developing, and I'll have more news about what I'm doing and whatnot as we go further. But basically, my role is to work with coastal managers on the West Coast to figure out what sort of data and tools they need to do their job, and connect them with resources that we have at NOAA. So there's a lot of elevation data and land cover data and things like that, and all these sorts of tools. I know my predecessor, TJ Moore, presented to the group on some tools about a year ago. So I'm still learning what the whole breadth of my role is, but that's the gist of it for now. I'm based in Hood River, Oregon, but we'll be traveling down the coast here and there. But one thing I wanted to mention is that the Office of Coastal Management, the folks I work for, is hosting a conference in February called Coastal GeoTools, and it happens every 2 years, and it's sort of the premier geospatial conference for coastal communities. And usually there are 300 to 400 coastal managers there, from floodplain and land use managers, engineers, geospatial analysts. And usually participants represent federal, state, and local governments and private sector. And this year, we're hoping for some representation from tribal governments as well. So there's a focus on expanding the sessions to include tribal coastal managers or geospatial analysts that are working in the coastal sphere. So I passed a document to Angie about stating what the conference is about. And I know this is pretty last minute. There's been a lot of outreach going on, but I wanted to get into the group sooner rather than later. Just if anyone's interested, in the next week or so, there's some contact information in the form I passed to Angie about who to reach out to if you're interested in going or presenting. And there is some financial assistance available for attending. They're still sorting that out, but we should have more information soon. But I'm excited to be here. I've watched some of the videos of past meetings. It seems like great collaboration and sharing going on here. So yeah, just looking to learn and listen and hear about what's going on in the group. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Brett. You're very welcome to be a member of this group. We're happy to have you. And just, for the group, Brett reached out really proactively, wanting to participate in this. So we're just pleased about that. We love to have NOAA folks here. Okay, is anybody else? No, everybody else is not new. And so what we do, that's actually a good segue into member announcements, which is what we'll do next. And then we're going to hear from Ben Hatchett, one of our members from the Desert Research Institute, and Catherine Lambrecht, I hope I said that right, from Arizona State University. They've been doing some research together that I think this group will find really interesting on extreme weather related to climate change and that relationship with communications. So that's going to be our main.
Can I interrupt and have Kat introduce herself too?
Yeah, we can do it now. Okay. Sure.
Sorry, Kat, I'm going to put you on the spot.
No worries. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Kat Lambrecht. I'm an assistant professor of technical communication at Arizona State University, and my research focuses on extreme hazard communication, risk communication, and sort of bridging the gap between expert and public or community audiences when it comes to medical rhetoric, when it comes to the weather, and other topics that are meaningful to people. So really happy to be here, and thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to have you. All right, so Brett was doing a good job kicking us off with member announcements. And so anything that you feel like folks in this group would benefit from hearing about, whether it's something related to tribes, climate change, health, and data. Okay, so has anybody got any updates they'd like to share?
Lori.
Hey, you guys, Lauren Montserrat, at long last, a year late, we have published our indicators of climate change report, including the 8 tribal reports and all the other stuff. And it's a tome. It's over 600 pages, but the tribal reports are also pulled out separately because there's been great interest there, and they're really good. Thanks.
Wow, great. Lori, do you want to share a link in the chat? And then would you also like to talk to us about that in December?
Sure thing.
Thank you. Awesome. I would love to dive in on it.
So excited. So happy to have that out. On a related note, I guess, we are kicking off our next series of webinars for the Tribal Climate Health Project next Thursday. We got a great number of terrific applicants for this new series, which is focused on, as always, people who work for tribes and people who are working for tribal serving organizations. And this time it's at a little bit of a higher level. We're asking for people who have some experience to join us for these 12 monthly roundtables over the next year, where we can share some of the more advanced things that we've learned with one another and help to get people from the beginner and intermediate, and really into the advanced stage of climate adaptation planning. And so a lot of what we've been doing in this group, I think, is going to be a part of those conversations, and be prepared to get invitations from us to speak to those groups as well. Next week is the opening, so we're not having any guest speakers next week, right, Angie?
Yeah, no guest speakers, but I just put the chat or I put the link in the chat. You can see all of our topics. So it's once a month for 12, right? 12 sessions, and you can see the topics we'll be covering. And if you feel like you really could contribute to that conversation on any one of those topics, we would love to chat with you about speaking.
And on actually somewhat related, but I'm just sort of fangirling right now, because yesterday I had a meeting at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and I got a behind the scenes tour, and I went into the botany lab, and they have this really terrific set of data about plant growth and where plants have been collected in San Diego County. And it's just a wonderful piece of data that I had never really considered. I kind of knew of its existence, but I hadn't thought about how useful it could be. And it has these maps of where different species were collected over the years. So that way we can go back and look at those maps and say, these species aren't appearing here anymore, but now we're finding them in these other places. So it's this historical data that we can use to compare with habitat change that's happening in the county on the basis of plant movement. And I could have stayed in that lab all day. I wish I was still there, but it gave me a lot of great ideas about what we could do with data, and also about how community members can contribute to that by finding a way to gather their data as local environmental observers, or as part of iNaturalist or something like that. So super excited. And then the other thing, and I'll give this quickly, but we also went to the entomology lab, and they have a a lace wing, which is a teeny tiny little fly. It was like the size of a grain of rice, this tiny little thing that was collected by Charles Darwin. And it had the little tiny tag attached to it that in little tiny pen and ink, I mean, literally the tag was like the size of my pinky fingernail, but it was written where he collected it and C. Darwin, and he collected it on the voyage of the Beagle. And I nearly fainted right there on the spot. If my life had ended at that moment, I would have been okay with it. So I just wanted to share my geek out moment about science and data with all of you. So thank you for indulging me.
I think you're in the right place.
Yes.
I always think about that when I'm in our Santa Barbara Natural History Museum too. I'm like, they're so good at communicating it. Speaking of communications, right? I'm like, how do I get that and show it into a vulnerability assessment? All right, who else?
Hey, it's Claudia. I dropped a few things in the chat, but there is a mini grant funding opportunity on climate and health through NACCHO, and those that request for applications is open until December 12th. So please share broadly. Also, the NCA 5 draft was just released 2 days ago and is open for public comment for the next 12 weeks.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up.
Claudia, can I just comment on that by saying the media always pulls out the worst things on there, and like everything that Americans value is disappearing. And I'm like, I still have boots. I'm okay.
Shasta, do you have a role at all? Are you
In
contributing on
NCA 5, no.
Yeah.
No,
The
but
California stuff, yes.
but the California one, hopefully, yes.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, public comments, sometimes there is some good comments in there. You got to sift through them.
Yes.
Anybody else feel like they have to like reproduce their DNA in order to just comment on all the things there are to comment on right now? It's like a comment frenzy. I need 8 Angies just to keep up with all the comment opportunities.
I think if I cloned myself, I would end up being an evil version of myself, like evil Spock, but that could be fun.
Oh, anything else?
Yeah, I have a quick update. I mentioned this actually in the last meeting because we were imminent on the HPI Utah launch, but it's launched.
Yay.
It's out there. It exists. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the interactive map. I want to point out we have implemented in the view indicators function, there's an overlay layer that overlays the American Indian areas in Utah. So you can see where the intersections are with the census tract level data. So you can try and use that to get some specificity for the hundreds of additional decision support layers that we provide alongside the HPI for tribal communities in Utah. So we're really excited about it. Please check it out. Let us know what you think. The Utah Department of Health and Human Services, who partnered with us on this, did a really fantastic job with community engagement. And we're just so pleased to have it out in the world.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
It's all really great stuff. We can add it to next time we send out something to our listserv, we can add all of this stuff.
Hi, this is Neil Maeslish. This is actually the first time I've been on this call, though I've been in conversations with Angie before. I work with Helen at the Alliance, the Public Health Alliance, Southern California. I'm an epidemiologist. I've worked on climate change issues for probably over a decade, both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side. And just tell me if you already know about this, but the California Department of Public Health is going to be launching a rather huge program in syndromic heat surveillance. They're getting it on the order of 30 positions. And they have commitments to the local health departments. And I think they may have mentioned in their budget change proposal of reaching out to tribal entities. So I wasn't quite sure whether you all have heard about that. It's still in the formative stage, but I don't know if you've invited folks from CDPH to come and talk to us about what they have in mind. So I just thought I'd mention that. It's not off the ground yet, but it will be happening over the next year or so.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. You know, we're good friends with CDPH. Samo usually comes to these meetings. He may actually show up today. He's there. He manages the tribal work for CDPH in the climate change office. So he's great. And we're actually going to be, I think we're going to be working with them in a little bit more of a formal role, the Tribal Climate Health Project. But thank you. I don't really have the syndromic heat surveillance on my radar. So that's good. We can ask him about that.
It's going to be a huge program. They've asked for 30 positions, which is bigger than almost any other surveillance program for even for communicable diseases. It's just huge. So anyway, a lot of money and a lot of resources will be flowing through that program. I hope they dedicate resources to the tribal entities.
Yeah, you know, that reminds me, it's worth mentioning too, how much there's resources all over the place. And OPR out here in California has new funding opportunities that are being built right now. So there's an adaptation planning grant. Actually, Lori, do you know about this? There's an adaptation planning grant, and they're targeted communities. You know, they're talking a lot about tribes. So California Native American tribes and federally recognized. So it doesn't have to be federally recognized, but they're trying to target a lot of those dollars towards tribes. And then there's going to be another one, a regional resilience planning, I want to say, coming after that, and another one after that on extreme heat. So lots of resilience dollars coming that, you know, California keeps wanting to target tribes. So that's great. Okay, you know, the other thing I'll mention in good news for the Tribal Climate Health Project is we were awarded another year of training.
Oh, yeah.
Grants. Yeah. Do you want to talk more about that, Shasta?
Yes, what she said.
Yeah, we're excited. It'll be our 5th round of BIA funding to continue Tribal Climate Health Project's trainings. It's great. We'll tell you more about the scope of work. You know, every time we do it, we do a little slightly different angle on our trainings. This one is bringing in experts from different fields. So we were trying to branch out from the climate crowd and bring in folks from related fields to help us conduct trainings, to be involved in these trainings. And so folks from public health, folks from emergency disaster preparedness, like the adjacent fields, trying to do more to kind of weave these things together. Okay, great. That was good updates. Anything else before we move on to our speakers? Okay, perfect. All right, so I think Ben, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce, you guys know Ben, PhD from Desert Research Institute. He's the assistant research professor in atmospheric science. And then we're joined today also by Catherine, who just introduced herself, another PhD from Arizona State University. She's an assistant professor in interdisciplinary humanities and communication, as well as, let's see, a senior global future scholar. So super happy to have you guys. We've been wanting to hear from Ben about his research, and it sounds really interesting. So Ben, go ahead and take it away. Go ahead and drive your screen.
Sorry, I was muted. Everyone we can see we're good. Looks good. Cool.
Yes.
Sweet. Well, yeah, thanks, Angie and Shasta, for having me talk a little bit about a few of the ongoing weather and climate inspired research activities, predominantly in California, but also I'll talk more westwide and a little bit internationally as well, since a lot of these problems are not just centered on our specific local communities. We're in an era of global issues. And that's, I think, good for perspective in a lot of ways, and ways to think about what's going on and what we can learn from others that may be seeing things happening sooner than we are. And so a way I like to kind of start talking about a lot of these things is this figure that was drawn after myself and a few others gave a talk a couple years ago about the different time scales, the different spatial scales, and the different processes happening as we go through this change. And I think this is a good way to start kind of in a visual sense to just really think about the interactions of these different processes that occur at different times. They can occur in a matter of 15 minutes or over many decades, and they can influence one hill slope or the entire planet. And so as we just kind of think about that as we go through it, I think it's helpful to just consider all of these different time scales and space scales that are interacting and how we can use those to kind of place everything into a perspective. And then I want to also give us another kind of thing to start off thinking about is that what we're seeing unfold before us shouldn't be surprising. I know a lot of it probably is surprising that it's happening this quickly and now, and that is the surprising part, but what we're seeing is not surprising. All of these changes and the impacts are expected, if not even maybe underestimated. And for many decades now, we've known this was going to happen with improving confidence and nuance, but the earliest models were really good at forecasting these things. So it's what's happening is not surprising. The surprising part is how quickly things are happening. So we got the what right, but not quite the when. And I think that's what really motivates this need for vulnerability assessment and resiliency and really thinking about what do we need and what can we really leverage that we have now to work towards more resiliency right now, not next year, not in 10 years, not in 50 years, but right now, as well as those longer time scales, because we can always improve. So just a couple images to put that together of kind of things we didn't really expect to happen. This was the Caldor fire last year that burned a huge swath of land from basically across the entire Sierra Nevada. This is as it was heading right towards Lake Tahoe. We want to see a nice, beautiful blue lake, not a big giant plume of smoke. And on here, you can see other fire scars. Here's the 2013 American fire. Here's the 2014 King fire, which actually these two fire scars were kind of helpful for this year's mosquito fire, which I'll show a picture of in a second, because they sort of helped hem it in and prevent it from expanding all the way across and then becoming a really, really big challenge. But it was still, not the severity and size of fires that we really want to see on our landscape, but this is where we're at. And then just later that year, about almost a year and a couple weeks ago, we had one of our biggest October storms of all time, where we had 1 in 500-year rainfall totals at the daily time scale throughout much of Northern California. And we saw what it looked like when it could just rain consistently for 24 straight hours and put down, I think we measured 10 inches of rain in 24 hours at our house in Sonoma County. And so it was really impressive to see what a warm, moist atmosphere can do. And these are another thing that we expect to see more of going forward, and we should be planning for, of not just how do we prevent everything from washing away, but how can we more effectively capture and use that water. Death Valley this summer, you probably heard of some of the big flooding events there. Very extreme short duration rainfall, which kind of creates some beautiful landscapes. It fills back in these desert washes at the expense of flooding roads and trapping people, but these intense thunderstorms are another piece of the puzzle and that can affect a lot of places at a very local scale, but they can have some big impacts. And we should be considering what kinds of things we are doing with our built environment with respect to these kinds of hazards as well, that are very short and very rare, but when they do happen, they are impactful. Then of course, here's our somewhat interesting picture of sunset over the mosquito fire. Not what we want to see when we look at our cameras, but this is something that we've been seeing and we're expecting to see more of. And we have a very short window to deal with this before it kind of irreversibly changes things. And I'll talk more about some of the research side of what fire does to our snowy environments, because to me, snow is one of our biggest potential things that we are going to lose. And it is something that's really going to be a huge challenge, and it's to deal with as that snow changes. Our natural reservoir is really, really key, and we're losing that quickly. And we don't want that to happen, but there is some hope that I'll show with respect to that. And then we kind of had, as Shasta probably got 15 inches of rain at her house, maybe not quite that much, but this was the Hurricane K that was earlier this year, happened right after that big heat wave. And it's just like, wow, what next? Now we're having hurricanes in California. This is just a little bit crazy, but I think leveraging all of this and the growing interest in the public to really motivate change is a good way to capitalize on these crazy events and turn them into something really positive. So just a couple expectations that are happening during what we're calling the ongoing drought, our 2020 through present drought. And to me, these are really what I use as motivation for a lot of the research questions. All these different things that can happen when they happen, whether it's extreme precipitation, short duration, high intensity like thunderstorms, or if it's big storm scale precipitation from these huge long duration storms, whether we're losing snow, we have low stream flow and fishery issues, temperature issues in the rivers and reservoirs and lakes, soil moisture, fire behavior, extreme heat, extreme cold. These really help motivate these kinds of questions of, well, how is your community affected by this? How were they affected? How resilient are you? What have you learned from these kinds of things? So of course, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are the kinds of things that I think it's important to document and go back and look and ask questions of, how are these affecting us? How might they change? And how can we improve our resiliency going forwards to address these and kind of head them off? And there's many different ways to do that. But as what I'll talk a little bit about, and Kat's going to talk a lot about, is the role of communication and getting people aware of this and making the right decisions, taking protective action before things get too crazy. So a lot of the focus of recent work has really been on snow and fire, as we're seeing fires burning larger and generally hotter and moving up into our once snowy places. It's bringing up a lot of interesting questions. So that inspires me to strap as much stuff onto my backpack as I possibly can carry and go wander around with the students, collecting data and trying to figure out what is going on and what might be happening here. And so we know there's this historical decline in snowpack. We've been losing our snowpack over the historic period as a result, largely of warming, as well as kind of longer dry periods, both mainly in the edges of the season, the shoulder seasons, the fall and spring, but now we're starting to see interesting things in the middle of winter. And so typically we have our maximum snowpacks around April 1st, plus or minus a couple weeks, but those peaks are going down. And if you've spent some time in the Sierra Nevada at higher elevations, there should be a lot more snow at the end of March at 7,500 feet. Than what we see here. So this is not what we want to see. And this is what we thought we wouldn't see until 2050, 2080, but here we are. And we expect these snowpack declines to continue. So a lot of work we've been doing with Lawrence Berkeley Lab has been trying to estimate the timing and magnitude of snowpack loss, both in the Western United States, and that's some work shown on the left-hand side, where we can see different regions respond a little bit differently to a warming environment. The Western Sierra Nevada and Cascades kind of have this continuous decline, whereas it takes a bit more warming to really impact the more interior mountains like the Rockies and the Wasatch Mountains. So their time is coming. And we've since expanded that approach to look at snowpack decline throughout the American Cordillera. We know all of these regions shown in black here are our mountain regions where snow is our great reservoir, and it's not looking good as we go forward in terms of what's going to happen to that reservoir. We start looking at when do the colors change from blue, which is what everything is based upon, and we're really generally happy in there, not in all cases, but typically. And then as we transition to red with ongoing time here at the bottom, or global mean warming, we hear a lot about we got to keep warming to less than 2 degrees, less than 1.5 degrees. And so a big piece of this work was really putting snowpack change into that global context of what level of global warming as a collective planetary community do we need to keep our warming to prevent this low to no snow future, where basically if it's not already broken, it's going to break going forward. And an important finding from this was that the southern hemisphere is actually leading by about 10 years compared to the northern hemisphere. And so in places like Chile, where we're already starting to see these very persistent low snow periods and drought periods. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn from how Chile is dealing with this, where their vulnerabilities and susceptibilities lie. And my hope is that some of this will inspire a little bit more international coordination, where we can hopefully help them out with some solutions, and then we can see how to further implement those solutions when we get to that point back in the northern hemisphere. And some recent work we did was to take a look at this at a little bit finer scale throughout California. And we took, as part of the California Fourth Assessment, they produced this worst case 20-year drought. And so I did a little analysis on, well, let's take that worst case drought and let's see how our seasonal snow transitions to non-seasonal snow. So we like seasonal snowpacks because that's our reservoir. That's the snow that stacks up over the winter, and we can estimate how much water we have in that reservoir and make a bunch of decisions based upon that. But as that climate becomes warmer and drier, and that seasonal snow becomes more ephemeral, where we don't really know if it's going to be there or not. It might be there for 2 weeks, it might be there for a month and a half, but it's not going to be there throughout the season. That's where things get concerning. And in that 20-year dry spell period, which is thought to be, based on this model, in the middle of the century, so not at the end where the maximum warming takes place, we still have 81% loss of our seasonal snowpacks throughout California and Nevada and parts of the southern Oregon and kind of southeastern Idaho region. So that's a huge change of snow that is going to be less predictable and less persistent. And therefore, we're going to have to think about how are we going to deal with that in these major river systems, as well as at the local scale, the groundwater that people use at the local kind of catchment scale is going to be affected by this as well throughout the Sierra Nevada, and particularly up in the kind of north coastal regions of California. So associated with that snowpack decline, we also see a decline in the total amount of runoff. In total, that decline is about half. So our rivers will have half as much water moving through them, and that water is going to be coming out of the system a little bit earlier because the snow is closer to the melting point. We're going to see peak flows happening earlier. And the big problem there is with reservoir management, because we right now cannot store that water earlier in the season. We have to keep flood pool space. So how are we going to deal with this? Opens up a lot of questions in terms of making our management more flexible, thinking of ways to store that water differently or in different places, and coming up with some creative solutions to deal with not only less runoff, but runoff that comes out of the system earlier. And we can also think about things like, how is this going to influence our stream temperatures and our fisheries? Because if there's less cold snowmelt later in the hot season, that's not good for the fish. And so we'll want to think about ways to address that challenge. And then back to this growing wildfire challenge. Now you can actually see here the fire scar of the Caldor fire, and then some of these older fires up here. So we're seeing a lot more fire in the high elevations. So using that same seasonal and ephemeral snowpack classification, I counted up the satellite-based fire detections in our mountains in California. And we've always had fire up there since 2001. There's always been fire, some years worse, some years better. Some of them, these drier years, 2007, 2008, a little dry period there. Not terribly bad during our previous drought, but following on that, where we had a couple interesting years, a little bit bigger, and then a huge jump, a factor of 10 increase just in the past couple of years. And it's these big step changes that I really get concerned about, because it's like, whoa, something different is happening. We're moving into a new world here. So we're seeing this factor of 10 increase in snow zone fire activity. And we can look at that from a map perspective. We can see where are seasonal snowpacks located, where are our ephemeral snowpacks located, where are we seeing these fires? And the big take-home piece from this is a lot of the fire that we're seeing in these recent years, they're not these small little fires scattered about. They're these really big ones like the Dixie Fire, the Caldor Fire, the Mendocino Complex, or the August Complex, some of these Southern Sierra Nevada fires. They're big ones, and they take up a lot of space, and they influence a lot of our natural reservoir. And so that has kind of motivated some of this work to evaluate how snow changes when we burn it at different severities. And some work that my graduate student Ariel has done shows that the more severely you burn the forest, the greater the impact you have on that snowpack through changing the amount of radiation that makes it to the surface by removing the canopy, but also all of this burned material falls on the snow, makes it darker, it lowers its albedo, and means it absorbs more of that solar radiation, so it can melt faster and easier. And so fire increases the radiative forcing on snow by a factor of 20. And we now are seeing 10 times more fire activity in our snowy places. So putting these things together, to me, that's a little bit worrisome. And we need to kind of think about, what are we going to do about this? And projections show very similar things. We expect to see more fire in our once snowy places. And this is a way to kind of take these different transition regions that I previously showed and count up the percent increases in annual burned area. And so we see big changes in a lot of the seasonal snowpacks that become ephemeral, especially in the northern part of the state. The higher elevations will also start to see more fire activity based on these projections. Places that don't change, still going to have more. And then we even still expect a little bit more fire in the very highest elevations. And a compounding problem with this, so this is a couple pictures of what post-fire snow looks like. And so you can see why the albedo declines because the snow surface gets much darker, is this midwinter drought and midwinter dry spells when we expect to be accumulating snowpack during the middle of winter. But when we have a big dry spell and we have a very dark snowpack, that's going to lead to rapid meltout. And so there will not be a quiz on all of these pictures showing here, but the thing to take home is in 2 different years that both had dry spells in this top figure, without fire, the snow didn't really change. It just kind of hung out and did the same thing. There was a little bit of melting, but after fire, these 2 burn stations had this rapid drop off. We don't normally expect a rapid drop off in snow during our snow accumulation season. And that is the big concern, is that we're going to start seeing this over larger areas. That's going to change the mountain hydrology. And so we've done some other work with remote sensing to show just how much snow cover fraction, how much area covered by snow changes in the post-fire environment. So we have our 2 dry spell years. The redder colors mean decreases in snow. Bluer colors are snow doing better. 2013, we had some snow loss at the lowest elevations here on the left-hand side. But compare that to after the Caldor fire, and this black outline here shows you where that fire perimeter is, and we see huge changes within the fire. And so that's kind of scaling this up to all these other areas. These are effects that are going to be magnified across the state and across the western region and across mountains worldwide that are undergoing fire. We also did a little comparison with the meteorology, and the idea here is to show that both of these 2 years were actually really similar. In terms of the placement of the ridge offshore, which we know brings dry conditions. Part of the idea here is to really isolate the effect of the post-fire environment. Similar conditions, but when we make the snow darker, it melts away sooner. And this methodology that Kristen Gerges at Scripps has developed is really cool, not just for these kinds of analyses, but she's developing this into a sub-seasonal to seasonal forecast system for persistent ridging and dry and hot conditions, and out of season heat waves are another area that this is being applied, especially for Southern California, for these kind of midwinter heat waves that catch people by surprise, as well as flood events and then big atmospheric river storms that will bring heavy precipitation for days on end and can lead to flooding. So similar years, but the snowpack really responded strongly to that radiative forcing. So a couple takeaways from this, if we really like our snow, based on this analysis that we did globally, we see that the time for these low to no snow conditions, whether it's just extreme years or episodic, where we have 5-year periods of this low snow, or more persistent, where we're looking at 10-year windows, those happen sooner in the Southern Hemisphere, and we're already starting to see that. And they happen with a little bit less warming there as well. And so to avoid the onset of these low to no snow conditions in Western North America, we need our global warming to be less than 2.3 degrees C. And so there's a new paper that just came out talking about a bunch of different cascading effects and basically collapses of really important systems. Most of those, we want to stay below 2 degrees C. So this is kind of consistent with this. And we've got about 20 years to really replumb our system to figure out how are we going to deal with this. And we know from past, what happens? Now we need to go forwards and say, what are we going to do when this happens? Not every couple of years or every 5 years, but every year. A positive takeaway I have from some of this recent exciting, interesting, and not so much fun extreme weather and climate is the role of communication. And this is something that Kat's going to talk a lot about and has done some really cool work on, is this capability of communication to enact rapid and meaningful change. And I think our California heat wave this September really highlighted that, when demand is creeping up and we're about to completely collapse our system, and a text message goes out from the state, induces rapid conservation and keeps us away from that full collapse of the system. And that's one example of communication, and getting a message out to a lot of people, hey, we need to do something to take protective action. Heat waves, I think, are just one of the best examples of these messaging to make a difference. And we have some other examples from air quality or cold or hot events. And so applying this to other applications with heat health or water use efficiency, we're in a drought, we really need to conserve water at these certain points in time, can make a big difference. Some work that Kristen Vandermolen's been leading in San Diego with some focus groups on really trying to figure out how to improve our our reach and effectiveness of heat communication in a county that has very different heat wave and heat impacts. The county varies from a very pleasant maritime climate to a very hot inland desert. And so we actually see different types of heat events taking place in these different regions and taking people by surprise in different ways than the people who are very used to heat. Key things that she found in leading this work is really having diverse communication channels, very specified content, such as things that include language that is created by the communities it is aiming to communicate with. So if we don't have people who speak English as their first language, we should have those same people telling us what are the right words to use when we create this heat messaging, and us being kind of people like the National Weather Service or public health agencies, and then developing more formally coordinated campaigns to really put all of this information together and get it to people. Evidence for the role of early warning systems comes from some analysis we did on a few extreme 2020 events, where we looked at mobility data from cell phones and Facebook users, and whether it's hurricanes or heat and smoke waves or cold spells, people respond to this. It's very, anecdotal. We don't go outside when the weather's terrible, but when the weather, if we know it's going to be bad because we've been told and we've been told what to do, we can change our activities. And so I think there's some good evidence in here for the role of early warning systems to say, hey, we're going to have terrible air quality and it's going to be hot. You can do these things to try to mitigate those impacts on you. And we can do that several days before the events to try to get people to do things. Of course, hurricanes, we see constant examples. No one wants to leave. I don't know how to solve that problem, but we can collectively work on this as a group to improve the motivation to get people to take protective action. I'll just finish
Hey,
here.
Ben.
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. I was going to give you a time check, probably about 5 more minutes for presentation before we should leave some time for discussion at the end.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll just quickly, and then so we can make sure Kat gets here too. So now we're working a lot with prescribed and cultural fire, and I think there's a ton of cool research interests we can address with that. Identifying when it's safe to burn, how to communicate these conditions, and figuring out how that will change in the future. And then really communicating with the community. We see a lot of people are stoked on this, but others totally freak out, and that makes complete sense because of smoke and post-fire trauma. And so getting them involved and getting them comfortable with bringing fire back onto the land is going to be a really important piece. So lots of opportunities, lots of things happening. I'll share this with you all so you can read through this, and we'll call that good and move over to Kat. Thank you very much.
Oh, it says that I cannot share my screen. Maybe I can.
Okay, you should be a co-host now. Should be able to be good to go.
All right, awesome. Well, I'm just going to give a really quick overview, about what the communication piece of all of this work looks like. So I have my doctorate in rhetoric, which is always fun to explain to people because they assume like, you trying to manipulate me, right? Like you have your doctorate in manipulation. And I explained to them that, rhetoric is something that is very ancient. It is a way to study language and underlying messages in order to better bridge gaps that we have. We know that a lot of the best science is lost when people don't understand it or people can't relate to it. So what my job is to come in and really help build resilience through shared language. So I'll start with just why rhetoric. Like I said, it goes way back, as far back as Aristotle, who you may have heard of, but you might be wondering what he's done for you lately. What I really study is how methods from that far back help us build consensus through language, listen to community language, and identified shared values. So a huge part of what I do is listen to public audiences, figure out what kinds of things do they value, and then embed those values back into communication so that there's more trust and more resilience between different stakeholders. So I'm going to skip through a bit of this. I want to overview 3 kinds of methods that I use to help people communicate, specifically science, more effectively to public audiences. The first is by identifying something called commonplaces, and these are language markers that help us identify ourselves as part of a community. So if I say, but it's a dry heat in the state of Arizona, everyone knows that I'm joking about how there are limitations. No matter how dry heat we have when it's 115, it's really hot, right? Someone from Minnesota, someone from Baltimore might not respond to the same way in those little languages that flag community membership. I also look at large banks of language. So for example, I'll collect everything that the CDC says for a year about COVID and figure out where are the common terms, the most used terms, how do they talk about risk assessment, these sorts of things. And then the project that Ben and I are working with in conjunction with a larger team is about identifying risk thresholds. So giving survey participants visualizations about extreme weather and asking how did they use that information. So on sort of the first project where we're identifying heat commonplaces, this is based on some work that Ben and I did in conjunction with some other folks, trying to figure out why people do not take extreme heat more seriously in Arizona. So we analyzed 4,304 public comments. Like I said, a lot of listening to public people in the public, and just figuring out what they said. And we found out that 48% of the time, people are sharing feelings or reaction. And oftentimes these reactions normalize heat. So this meme is a really great example. Stop whining about the heat, we're Arizonans, right? And this is something you see in Arizona a lot. We know that this kind of behavior of seeing heat as part of who we are can lead to sort of a barrier for resilience, right? Because people assume they're safe when they're not. Another type of thing you can do to figure out communication and how to strengthen sort of expert to public communication is to look at expert banks of language. So this second project, I collected public health department communication about COVID-19 in the 5 largest cities for 2 years and found out where the language sort of overlaps and where it doesn't, right? And I won't go into a ton of detail here, but this is something that you can do with any publicly accessible banks of language to sort of figure out where do people overlap and where do they diverge. And then you can target your communication to sort of bridge that gap. And then the final project we're working on now is figuring out risk thresholds. So we have surveyed both public and stakeholder audiences with extreme forecast visualizations and asked what helps people make decisions based on risk. Here are just a few examples, but things like timeline, things like color coding, historical knowledge, all of these things sort of make a big difference to people because climate is incredibly contextual and based on place, right? So we see patterns in these kinds of language segments emerging from the populations we study. So I know that was a very quick overview, but I want to leave time for questions. So I will stop there and send it back over to Angie.
Thank you so much, guys. Gosh, that's a lot of great stuff. I want to open it up to questions. I got like 1,000, but what do you guys have?
So many questions. Catherine, that was great. I would love to have you come back when we have more time for you to talk about this more, because this is huge. Also, I'm a linguistics and language nerd from way back with anthropology and the cultural importance of language and language use. So that's not a question. That's just a hi. And Lori's got her hand up. So Lori.
Those were both great presentations. Ben, you have a way of making the end of the world sound so upbeat. Catherine, do you have links that you can provide to your research? I'm fascinated by it, and I'd love to just like listen to you for a whole day.
Yeah, I'm happy to put the links, especially the studies that Ben and I have done. I will put the links in the chat, and I'll also put a link to this tool called Voyant Tools, which is a language software that is freely accessible. So if you ever have, let's say, 10 documents and you want to find common terms, you can just stick it into the software and it'll generate a bunch of data for you. It's a great tool. So I'll put that in.
And this seems really timely because like even the project that I'm working on that pays my paycheck, I think our time has run out. You know, it's not time for indicators of climate change. It's time for adaptation and resiliency. And so that's where we need to be moving, and that communication and risk communication around that, I think, is critical. So thank you both so much.
Hi, this is Neil. I have a question. I mean, the public health community is fixated on the value of health in communications, and I think our experience with COVID kind of blew that up. Because of the political polarization, I'm just wondering how the political polarization has gotten so severe, and the same language conveys different values to different communities, and how you bridge that kind of gap. That wasn't a rhetorical question, Kat. That was actually a question. I know.
That one is all you.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Ben, unless you want to. I don't want to be a question answering hog. So if you want to chat, go for it. But so what I would tell you is that no matter how divergent we get, and things are looking pretty rough out there, and we are in election week, so it's fresh on everybody's mind, there are always things that bring us back together. And part of what rhetorical listening helps us do is figure out what are the core common things that, so for example, I live in Arizona. It's a very wild state with a lot of political divergence. But I know reliably that I can go and talk to anyone in my neighborhood, anyone at the grocery store about the weather and the experience of heat, and that will bring us together, right? So part of what I think resilience, an aim of resilience, is to find what are, you know, in a sea of things that make us different, what are the handful of things that really make us the same, and what problems can we work on together? And so, you know, spending time looking through public comments, you certainly see political differences pop up, but there is a lot of commonality, right? Everyone is invested in ensuring the survival of the community to some extent. Now, you know, it's more of an uphill battle for some than others, to let them know that, you know, the time is now that we really need to act, or the time was yesterday that we really need to act on some of these things. But the more you can link it to the grounded experience of community members, the better off things are. So to give just a quick example, if I was trying to, you know, let's say I'm trying to convince people in my neighborhood that climate change is a thing, right? Because we know that this is a communication struggle that we sometimes have with public audiences. I could choose to talk about all of the different metrics that we know that show that this is happening, right? Or I could say, well, you've lived here for 10 years. What differences have you noticed, right? Who do you care about in the community? Do you find that you have a hard time keeping, for example, your grandma safe from the heat, right? So the more you tap into people's lived experiences, the more personal it is. I think the better chance you have of bypassing some of that political divergence that is so embedded in the world we live in right now.
I was going to quickly mention that in Maricopa County, there's actually an amazing local health department led resilience coalition. So I
Yes.
don't know if you, because I was actually part of the crew that helped fund that activity through the Kresge Foundation a couple of years ago. But it would be really interesting to see how they use language to bring all those folks together. Sort of an interesting case study, because in a place that is so politically divided, we were astonished that they got this community resilience coalition together, and it's apparently still going on. So it's like 3 or 4 years now. Might be an interesting case study to see how did they pull it off, and what were the language cues that made people feel comfortable to participate.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I should look into that. I work with the extreme heat resilience communication network here that brings together a lot of different people. So I've seen a little bit of that sort of coalition building work done, but always looking for more examples of it. Thank you.
Ben, I made you host, so we got a minute left. I'm gonna need to leave at noon, but you guys can hang out and talk as long as anybody wants to hang out. I wanted to ask one question before I go, which well, I want to get this information into the hands of more people. Honestly, I want to send whatever delegate is over at COP27 from California and be like, to go talk about this. But there was an article from the New York Times recently that had a more glowy view of climate change. And it talked a little bit about how the projections have gotten slightly better than catastrophic. So where we were earlier considering 5 degrees, now it's looking more like 3, and that's much better for like human survival. What are your thoughts on that? I know it's not 2.3, and so it's not hitting the mark. Tell me about how you feel about it all.
So I guess, and this brings up another interesting, I think, challenge we've had with climate change communication is for so long, it was always 2100. Oh, that's when everything goes out to, and that's maybe where it stops, but no, it will keep going and could keep changing. And so we really need to have this longer view of things. And so I think now that the projections are a little bit lower, I think that's really good. At least buys us a little bit more time, because we'll just need to really make sure that we come over the curve. Because even at 2.3, 2.5 degrees, a lot of bad things, tipping points get crossed, and we really want to try to avoid those. So I think it's really shows that we can make a big difference, and we can cut our warming substantially, but we still have more work to do, and the gains will kind of just exponentially increase the more we reduce it. The fewer of these tipping points that we cross, the more ecosystem function and general climate stability will improve and maintain to kind of where we've come from and what we hope to continue to have. So it's good, but we still have work to do, I guess would be my short answer.
Right. Thank you guys so much. Continue chatting as long as y'all like.
Cool.
I'll
Thanks,
see you
Andy.
next time.
All right, Brett, you had your hand, I think, first.
Real quick, it's kind of crazy that Angie and I both have to leave. I'm already late for another meeting, but we're going to keep recording until Ben hangs up on us. So, and look at all these hands. I really want to stay and talk about this, but an environmental director's work is never done. So I'm out of here too, and I'll come and watch the recording later. And thank you all so much for the great presentations and discussion, and I'll see you later. Bye.
Cool.
And bye, Helen.
Brett, you're muted.
How about now?
You're good.
All right, cool. Yeah, first of all, I'll just say thank you both for a really great presentation. I think this is one of those great times where I, joined in to, help share things from my end with the group, and I end up getting a really wonderful, informative presentation that great. I think for Ben, that's a really great presentation, and for me, that's sort of really helpful in a maybe different way than for most, because I don't work really in water or hydrology or anything, but understanding these time horizons helps me understand likely where things are going to get most dire the quickest, and therefore where funding maybe focused eventually. So it's just really good to know about. I mean, not to mention it's very interesting to me personally. But those are really fantastic maps overlaying, looking at fire activity and snowpack. And then I guess also for me, one of the biggest things for my role with NOAA is basically figuring out how to turn the science into action. And so I'm really happy this is being recorded, because Catherine, a lot of the communication pieces you talk about are so vital to getting things done. Putting, like, there's so much science out there, and there's so many great data sets, but just they either aren't accessible, or they aren't communicated well, or people just don't have the technical know-how to work with them. So figuring out how to bridge those gaps and get data into the hands, or I guess formatted in a way or presented in a way that can be used by people, and then figuring out how to talk to people as well. It's so huge. So thank you both. This is really awesome, and I look forward to following both of your research.
Cool. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
Lori, I think you were.
Yeah, sorry, I have way too many questions. You guys are great teachers. Makes me want to go back to school. How do you deal with, you pointed to those heat alerts as a good example of warning. I know for me, the first time it happened, I turned everything off. The second time it happened, I was pissed. And the third time it happened, I turned the alerts off on my phone. And I care. So how do you deal with like over warning?
That's one of the, I think the saturation effect and the cry wolf effect, those are all huge issues in weather extreme communication. And Kat, maybe you have a good idea of like how to deal with that. I guess that's probably the pinnacle where we're at of struggle right now is, okay, it worked the first time, that's great. But then if that happened again a week later and you're like, well, the power stayed on, so maybe I should just not do it. Or, well, this is annoying. Like, when it was the alerts on your phone that you were next to a COVID positive person, and first you freak out and you're like, ah, and then you're like, how do I turn this off? This is really annoying. So it's a really good question, Lori. I don't have a good answer. Maybe Kat does.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer, but I am working on trying to figure out what is sort of at the innermost kernel of the problem, right? So I'm working in Phoenix and studying extreme heat, and some of the research that that Ben and Kristen and Bianca and I did looked at public heat, public responses to heat, and a lot of it is people respond with broken records, right? Like the classic example I think I talk about all the time in meetings with Ben is like the unicorn flipping over the table, right, meme, when people are mad about the weather. And there's a certain degree to which over communicating takes away its power. And I looked at a bunch of National Weather Service Phoenix posts and found which ones were shared the most. And there were two sort of trends. One, it was when records were being broken, which is not about heat safety, right? It was in the summer of 2020 when we were breaking heat records like every other day. But that's when people tend to get invested, is when we compete with the level of heat that we have. And secondly, almost none of them talk about heat safety until the end of the post, sort of below the fold is what I call it, or like below the digital fold, right? Where people stop reading. They just see, oh, it's hot again today. Look at us, we broke another record. Almost in this sort of like sad, like, this is who we are, the people who break records for heat, without ever talking about the safety piece. So I think moving the focus perhaps away from this sort of like, moving away from, we know people will like the weather when it's at the most extreme or want to share it only when it's at the most extreme, to talking about heat on days when, it's like the fourth day of heat in a row, and sounding an alarm then and being like, did you know that heat is cumulative, right? The impacts on your body aren't just walking outside on the hottest day of the year for 10 minutes, but sustained, patterns of heat impacting your body. So I think talking about heat on the days when it is not the most exciting or most like highest numbers, but when people are really, really at most risk, might be part of it. But I'm still working on it. And it's going to be my whole career in the next few years is figuring out that problem.
Cool. Neil, let's go to you and then Isabel.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Angie's issue in the New York Times. I actually read that article and it was going like this all the time. Like, I can't believe, and I just wonder what role, underreporting of emissions plays, and also, Ben, when we say things are happening faster than we think, I mean, how much is unreported emissions playing a role? The Air Resources Board, I think, recently congratulated itself. There's a little deflection in the roughly 400 million metric tons per year of CO2 equivalents emitted. And someone pointed out that, I think it was on the order of 20 million metric tons of forest fire combustion products, including the CO2, isn't, from forest fires in the same year, weren't included in the total. So people were saying, but they said, no, but that we're not responsible for that piece. That's not a human-driven activity in the narrow sense. And I'm just, now I think in today's times, there was using, remote sensing and satellite imagery to detect, there's roughly 7,000 point sources that are major methane emitters, and, steel mills, concrete factories from all over the world, and using sort of clever triangulation of satellite imaging, production figures and other things, piecing out, what the likely emissions are and what are reported. And the gist is that there's massive underreporting going on. So when this guy or woman who came up with the article, just was not sensitive to any of these issues and wasn't looking at the totality of emissions, it just made me feel like this kind of communication is really damaging. Think about what the implications of people in authority saying, see, things really aren't as bad as the scientists said they were. But in fact, it's not really well qualified in setting a counter narrative that the scientists were alarmists, where in fact, what Ben presented was what the scientific community, that we've been way too cautious for way too long in not being even more aggressive in our cries for immediate action. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there because
we're pushed for that narrative. I work for Cali, PA, and when our report just came out on climate change indicators, we were asked to be prepared with good news. Yeah. And I was like, there's not good news. This is not good news. But what's the upside? Like, no.
Yikes.
So you're right.
Yeah, and that's Greta Thunberg. I think her book just came out a couple weeks ago, but she had a piece, an excerpt from the book published in The Guardian maybe a month ago that got right at that point, that we're not counting all of it. And because so often in the counting that a government does, it's like, oh, well, that's actually not our emission, so we're not going to count it. We're going to shift it over here. And so there's this, I have no idea what that underestimate is, but it is probably non-negligible to say the least. And it's that's a huge problem. And then I totally agree too, of like, let's not get too ahead of ourselves and congratulating us on what we're doing or not doing, and let's not distract at all from, we still have a long way to go. I mean, we can do it. That's great. It could be worse, but that's like 2% of the problem. We need to really focus on continuing to make the improvements here. Yeah, so that's I think a good example. I don't remember who wrote that New York Times article. I'll have to go back and look, but to see kind of like, yeah, or even just explaining like, well, this looks pretty good, but we're missing a lot. And even just that acknowledgement, if that wasn't there, that's probably a little bit concerning too. Cool. Isabel.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I actually had something to say more about the heat, but I did want to comment that that whole, you're waiting for good news and scientists say there's no good news. That's like the theme of every bad disaster movie ever, even the good ones. I mean, it's exactly that. It's always that. But my comment about the heat is, one of the problems is even when it's bad, you're not seeing everybody drop like flies. I mean, it has to be severe, right? Because we don't see, you got the ED, you got the 911 calls, you get the deaths, but it's not like all of the people that are affected, it slips by you. You don't, until it is severe for you, you don't see it. And it's like, well, what other communication could there be? And I've often wondered when people can see it, maybe it's I don't know, businesses where you look at the economic impact, because that's a lot bigger. It's not necessarily more communicative, but that was one thought. Because we're always asked, I always have to push out our local data on, what happened in San Diego, and it's like X many deaths and ED, and it's like it's not COVID. It just, the numbers aren't as huge, so people dismiss them. But one thing I don't see a lot of communication about at the sort of common level is there are a lot of medications that people take. And if you go looking on a variety of websites, because I started to collect, looking just so it's like, can we write anything on this? Just because it's not mentioned typically in the news, or you have to go to the Mayo Clinic website when they talk about it, it's reaching the medical community of, say, PCPs, because I was reading through this list, a very long list of many, many medications of different mechanisms, all of which could impact your ability to regulate heat for one reason or another. And I'm like, dang, I've taken a good handful of those. And for quite a while, I've never had a single doctor ever mention that. And I lived in San Diego a long time, and I've traveled. I love going to Arizona in the summer. It's never occurred to me. I've heard about the ones, when you put on an antibiotic and they say, be careful in the sun, but you never hear that. And there's a lot of them. It's a lot of people with chronic disease, blood pressure medications, heart medications, but also people who are taking medications for behavioral health conditions. I wasn't seeing a lot of that. I saw a few websites where, it was sort of, if you're broadly looking and there's a deep dive, they'll say, if you're on the yada yada thing, it could affect your, it's not broadly. And there's so many people that are on, anxiolytics or something like that, and they don't know. And they're already more vulnerable. But how to communicate that, I think it has to go through the medical community, maybe, more upfront and reiterative. That's just my thought, is one area of vulnerable communities is the people who take meds don't necessarily know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is, so I'm teaching a class this semester that partnered with Peoria in Arizona to create new heat outreach communications. And a couple of my students worked on making infographics. One was for heat medication or medications that interact with the heat for like a more senior audience. And then the other one was like you said, so many college students are taking medications that also interact with the heat. So I had a student who worked on, visualizing for those two different audiences, what are the best ways to make an infographic that tells you which heat medications, I say heat medications as if there's a medication for heat, which medications make you more vulnerable to heat. So we're hoping to get those, at least with the city partnership that we're currently working in, pushed out to actual audiences, but it's for sure something that is on our radar that is not common that we're seeing out there. A lot of the source material that my students used were from CDC,
Exactly. Yes.
Places where you would have to go looking for it, right? They're not necessarily things where people
Yeah.
just interact with that. It's not just on the news, right? So as part of what we're working on is how to bring attention to some of those very specific but very important vulnerabilities that people just don't think about,
Yeah, I'd be really interested in seeing some of those. I mean, nobody's pushing me to say, oh, come up with this stuff. I just, when I went out looking, it was like, yeah, maybe someday. So that would be a good thing. And I would be very interested in seeing what your students put out. It would be super, super interesting. Yeah, and you're right. There's a lot of, key populations. We work a lot with, like refugee or immigrant populations, or people for who don't speak English as their primary language. It'd be nice to get them that information too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
At the end of the semester, the place we're working with is called Project Cities. They put out a big report that combines all of my students' research in one place. So I am happy to send that to you, Isabel, if it would be helpful.
Yes, I'd love to see it.
Yeah. I will make sure that makes its way back to the group. Yeah, are there any other questions or thoughts or things we should chat about? I
think I'm good. But yeah, that was an awesome discussion. Thanks y'all for joining.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Thank you.
I can't wait to see my students tomorrow and tell them that this is on other people's radar. I think they'll be, I have one student in particular who works with elder populations in Phoenix, and I think she'll be really excited to see that someone's interested about what she's working on this semester. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, yeah.